Hello and welcome to another episode of Pushing Cardboard. This is number 33, Jason Carr and France 40. Jason is head of development for GMT, so I thought it'd be interesting to talk to a developer instead of a designer for a change. And then I'll take a look at the remake of France 40 from Mark Simonitch and compare it to a couple other games I have on the topic. And of course we'll have the usual newbie tips, news, and all the other falderall you've come to expect. For those of you watching this on YouTube, I don't usually wear a hat for these things, but my city, Calgary, has suffered a catastrophic water main break, and we're all on a restricted water use bylaw for the past couple of weeks and a couple more weeks after this. So we're only showering once a week. So I thought I'd spare you from my Einstein style hair. And then on top of that, I managed to contract another go around with the COVID. So for those of you listening, you can probably hear it in my voice. But I'm almost recovered from that. So all should be well. Anyway, back onto the regular stuff here. This episode of Pushing Cardboard is sponsored by Noble Knight Games. We had a little trouble with the link they had given me to use. Apparently it didn't work for Canadian customers, but it's all fixed now, and I have a new link that works for you no matter where you're from. I encourage you to try them out, and when you do, please go to pushingcardboard.com and use my links to let them know I sent you, or use the link that's in the Pushing Cardboard newsletter. News. The Charles S. Roberts Award winners for 2023 have just been announced. A couple surprises, at least to me, but for the most part, very deserving winners. Downfall by Chad Jensen and John Butterfield was the big winner, winning 3 awards, including Game of the Year. The other big winner was Red Strike from Yves Rattel from VUCA Simulations. This is a super package on the classic Cold War Gone Hot topic. It won for Best Operational Game, Best Hypothetical Game, Best Presentation, and also the Breakthrough Designer Award. I've been busy learning it, and I can tell you it's an amazing package. Land, air, and naval all come together at the operational level. It's not overly complex, but boy, there's a lot to take in. I was also happy to see a Blind Swords game, Grand Havoc, by Jeff Grossman, win for Best Civil War Game. Regular listeners know I'm a big fan of that system, so I'm happy to see it recognized. Revolution Games isn't as big a publisher as GMT, Compass, or MMP, so they fly under the radar a bit, but happy to say not this time. Due to the timing of my last full episode, there are now 2 GMT monthly updates to get through, so I'll just highlight a few things from the 2 of them combined. First up, Mark Herman has a book coming out called War Games According to Mark. It's available on the GMT P500 system, and as you might expect, I'm pretty sure it hit its P500 mark just in a couple of days. The 2024 replacement counter sheet will be coming to P500 in July, and new on P500, Purgatorio, Men of Iron Volume 6, looks to be late 1100s to the early 1300s, set in Italy, and then also Thunder on the Baltic, Flying Colors Volume 5. And then finally the announcement of the dates for GMT West this fall, October 17th to 20th. That's just the highlights. As always, there's a ton more. I've linked to both of them in my newsletter if you want to read the whole thing. Band of Brothers from Worthington is not dead. We haven't heard from this series in a few years, but in fact, they've just announced a Kickstarter is coming for a new volume set on the East Front, so that should be interesting. 1812, Napoleon's Fateful March, and Traces of Hubris are now available from VUCA Simulations. I've seen both, and the production level is top-notch as always. I had a great chat with Patrick Gebhardt from VUCA recently, so look for that in an upcoming episode. And then finally, along with his Coast Watchers game on P500 with GMT, Volko Ruhnke's Hunt for Blackbeard from Fort Circle is now on Kickstarter, so I encourage you to support that as well. What's on the table? Well, this month, let me tell you about Kernstown, part of the Blind Sword series from Revolution Games. This is an interesting package in that it features both battles of Kernstown, I think a year or 2 apart. Paul and I are playing the first of the 2, and it's an interesting affair. I'm the Union, Paul is the Rebels. One of the first things you notice in this scenario is that each of your leaders only commands a single brigade. In most of the games in this series, your leaders are division commanders, and when their chit is drawn, you get to choose which of their attached brigades to activate. Here, instead, we're drawing brigade commanders, so there's no choice. You just activate that brigade. Takes a bit of the choice out, but it's such a small engagement, so it wouldn't work any other way, as there's probably only one division commander on each side. The map has 2 main features, a small ridge called Pritchard's Hill in the upper center, and a larger ridge on the left called Sandy Ridge. The Union starts out on Pritchard's Hill, the Confederates start directly south. There's VPs for both hills, but there's more for Sandy Ridge on the left. The immediate problem for the Union is how many units to leave on Pritchard while driving hard for Sandy. In our game, I came out of the Chit Cup late on the first couple turns, and the Rebels beat me to Sandy Hill, though I've managed to hold Pritchard's Hill, and I think he's finally given up trying to drive me off it. But most of my units are battle-worn, and it's going to be hard to dislodge them from Sandy Ridge. The only good news left for me is that I managed to build up a lead in VP in the early game. He beat me to the ridge, but it still took him a while to actually control the victory hexes. There's still 5 turns to go, so he's more than enough time to catch and pass me, as he's scoring 6 VP to my 3 every turn at the moment. Unless I can prime off 1 or 2 of his 6 spots, he'll be winning this one. We'll see. It's been fun, and I'm really looking forward to the second Kernstown battle to compare the two. New games to the collection. A light month, other than a local game sale of some oldies I got for a good price. But first, one I'll definitely be featuring soon on the podcast. Limits of Glory, Bonaparte's Eastern Empires is from a new publisher, Form Square. I think I've mentioned them before. Anyway, this is their first game, and I've played it, and I look forward to talking about it. It's very different from anything I've played before, and its art style is unique as well. And other than that, here's the box of oldies I picked up. 1776, the game of the American Revolutionary War. This is the old Avalon Hill game. Back when it was still on the shelves, I just wasn't interested in anything much beyond the 2 world wars, so I gave it a pass. But it's one I've always wanted to look back on, check out. 2 18XX Railroad games, 1853 and 18 Chesapeake. I need to see what the fuss is about with the 18XX series. I haven't played any, so this will be interesting. Clash of Wills, Shiloh, 1862. Martin Wallace is a co-designer on this, which is usually good news, so we'll see. Devil's Den, this is another Avalon Hill game from 1980. It'll be interesting to see if it still holds up. This is one of those ones where I might only get a single play, but I think it only cost me $15, so it was worth checking out. And then None But Heroes. This is another line of battle game from MMP. I haven't played the only other one I have in this series, but as MMP reprints things so rarely, I can probably hang on to this and use it as a down payment on my kids' tuition down the line. Books. Well, I'm back onto another history book. This time it's Sicily 43, The First Assault on Fortress Europe by James Holland. It's a fairly detailed account, almost day by day in the different parts of the island. He details what went wrong with the paradrops and the glider landings and points out that the elite units that were landed by boat were way more effective. He shows the gradual disintegration of the Italian units and how the fighting went from feeling like a cakewalk in some spots early on to harder and harder battles as more and more German troops were brought to Sicily, and as the Germans retreated to the northeast tip where the terrain was mountainous and the width of the front kept shrinking. Perfect defensive terrain. There's also a fair bit about the air war, such as it was, and plenty from the German and Italian perspective, not just the big picture, but boots on the ground stuff. I don't think I've read anything by Holland before, which is a pity that I think I've been missing out on an entertaining author. Recommended reading if you're interested in the invasion of Sicily. Newbie tips. Looking at that piles of games and seeing American Revolution War games and American Civil War games, it put me in mind of what I think was a great mistake on my part when I was younger. I tended to only play games on periods of history I was fairly familiar with. Being Canadian, that meant I only knew the basics of the American Revolution and Civil War, and almost nothing about the English Revolution, or the Greeks for the Romans for that matter. They really did a shitty job of teaching us history. All I really knew about was the 2 world wars and the War of 1812, and that was mostly from books I read on my own time, nothing that I really learned in social studies. Somewhere along the line, I started to buy games where I didn't know the history and let the game be my introduction. I'd play the game, and if it sparked my interest, I'd go looking for books. I think this is a much more rewarding way to do things, and it's opened up giant chunks of history for me. I'm sure that's the way many of you have operated all along, but I mention it in case anyone listening is as backwards as I was. So my tip this month is simple. Take a chance on a game about a piece of history you know nothing about. You'll probably learn something and get a good game out of it to boot. All right. It's time for my interview with Jason Carr. While Jason is trying his hand at designing, he's known primarily as the current head of development at GMT. I thought it would be interesting to talk about what a developer actually does and see a bit about how the sausage gets made. Here it is. Okay, hello. I'm here at GMT West with Jason Carr. How are you doing, Jason?
Doing really well.
We're here today to talk about game development. What's your official title here at GMT? Head of game development, or what?
Yeah, head of development, director of game development.
Right. There's
there's not a lot of companies that have your position, like in the wargaming. I'm sure in the Eurogame space there's probably plenty, but in the wargaming and historical gaming space, there's probably not a lot of companies that have a dedicated head of development.
I don't think that there are very many. I think most wargaming companies, the owner of the company kind of fills that role.
Right. Yeah. That's what I was thinking. It's like so many of those companies are so small that it's almost a one-man or a two-man shop. How did you? I mean, what's your history with wargaming that got you to this idea that you were going to be a game developer?
Yeah, most of my gaming experience actually comes from outside of historical games. So I have a lot of experience playing games on the strategy side. So games like Fantasy Flight's big coffin box series of games, like StarCraft the board game.
Yep.
And Forbidden Stars, which is kind of the sequel to that. War of the Ring. And then my wife and I played a lot of Euro games for about a decade. And we just got progressively more and more into heavier games. So starting out with stuff like Agricola and moving towards heavier stuff. So I don't have a background primarily in wargaming. Wargaming for me is in the last 8 to 10 years.
Right.
And I got into that through Twilight Struggle, and then actually coming out here to the warehouse and having never played any war games. I was invited to play Virgin Queen by Jason Lindsay, and I played a game of Virgin Queen with him and Kirk Keckley and some of the other guys here, and just had a blast doing it. And so Jason spent the whole rest of the weekend just teaching me how to play Combat Commander and helping adjudicate some Combat Commander games, and I kind of fell in love with it.
Well, so it's like you were into hobby games, Euro games, but you're getting into heavier and heavier ones, and in some ways that you were gonna find us eventually, because this is going to be where you found the games that had the kind of meat on the bones that you were interested in.
Yeah, and it is interesting how my interest shifted from primarily mechanical interest of like, oh, these games are doing all these cool things that I have not been exposed to, and feasting on that, to actually being much more interested in the stories that they tell and the history that's behind them. I have a history background. I studied history as an undergrad. So history's always been something I love. But this was a way that I didn't know that I wanted to experience history.
It's been my experience that most history gamers, war gamers, are obsessed with the narrative. That like clever mechanics are great when they're in service of the narrative, and if there's any sort of disdain for Euro games, it's when they're all about the mechanics and the theme seems pasted on, and the narrative doesn't really emerge. So if you're a history guy, it makes sense that you'd come this way and go, oh, look at this. This tells that story.
Yeah, I think Gene was saying yesterday that one of the really big distinctions between Eurogaming and wargaming is that Eurogaming, the puzzle isn't reusable. Like you said, pasted on theme. Well, what's really interesting to me is if you look at some of the games that people really go after for pasted on themes, and I'll use a simple example that I don't think that was a major complaint for this, but it's a good example of what I'm getting at is if you've played Agricola and then you've played Caverna, they're very similar games. Mechanically, they are very similar. And so when Caverna came out, there was a lot of discussion about like, oh, is this Agricola 2.0? And in some regards it was, and a lot of the Eurogamers have chosen, like I'm either in one camp or the other.
Right.
They don't want to have both, right? But wargamers are almost the exact opposite. We're like, oh, Cuba Libre is Andy and Abyss again, and I want both of them because now I don't have to learn 2 sets of rules, I only need 1 set of rules. Right?
And they do, even though they have similar mechanics, they do tell very different stories.
Right. But I think that comes from the narrative elements that get mixed into the game during the production process and during the research process and during the design process. And those steps don't happen in Eurogame production. So a game like Agricola is really a mechanical puzzle that you're trying to solve and optimize for, and it's not a study of farming in a particular place in time.
Absolutely not. I remember buying that game because it was like, well, I'd sort of passed it by and I saw it was such a, big game, and it was like, well, I should, I don't want to be completely in the dark. And then it was like, just doesn't seem to have anything to do with what's on the cover and what's on the cards.
And at the end of the day, I mean, that's not a judgment of the game, because it's a great game, super fun.
Yeah.
But it is fun for reasons that have nothing to do with the history.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Same thing with like I could play Dominion over and over and over, but it's the same thing. It's like
You're not learning anything about medieval life.
right. But I'm puzzle solving and trying to outwit whoever I'm playing against. Yeah, for sure. Well, given that, so that's your history with the games. You came over from hobby games because you got interested in, well, you know, Twilight Struggle is, I think, a gateway drug for a lot of people. Yeah, good for Jason and Anapta, yeah. So how did you move from that to development? What got you to be a developer of games?
Yeah, so that actually comes back to that same story. My first time out here at the warehouse, I was walking around and looking at all the games because I had no idea any of these existed, right? And Mike Berticelli had Tank Duel set up, and he was teaching that to people. And this was back when it was still very rough prototype printouts from his computer. You know, he made a very nice prototype, but it was still black and white, mostly black and white prototype with handmade components. And I played it, and I was like, "Hey, do you want us to give you feedback, or are you just watching?" And he was like, "No, I want to hear what you think." And so I said, "You know, I wonder about this and this." And at that time he had taken the damage resolution cards. They were split into two different decks, and there was a third deck that was being used for morale. And I was like, "Hey, you know, you could combine these and have one deck of cards." And as I was describing it, he was like, "That's a really good idea." He was writing it down. And he ended up giving me his email address and was like, "If you think of anything else, let's talk." And I just saw the game as something that would be very appealing to somebody like me who played high conflict games like Nexus Ops and StarCraft and Forbidden Stars and War of the Ring, but was looking for a little bit more elegance in mechanism than what I had seen in like Virgin Queen, where it was like roll some dice and look at this table. And Tank Duel, using the cards for everything, even though it's still doing all the same thing, you're still rolling and checking. It's done in a way that is more intuitive to people who come from a hobby game kind of background. And so I saw a lot of potential there for the moments, the narrative, the story that's created. Like, if you ever watch people play Tank Duel, they will jump out of their seat at least once per game, where you'll hear them. I mean, when they play here, you just hear like this roar.
My first time to this event a couple of years ago, Mike was demoing a game, and there was like 8 of us around the table, and I blew up Harold Buchanan's tank, and yes, I jumped out of my chair.
A bunch of people cheer, and they laugh and point at Harold.
It was great.
So those moments combined with the fact that the game had an accessible set of mechanisms, it didn't have a CRT, it didn't have the like big die rolls.
Everything's on between the tank cards and the
boards,
the deck.
The decks and
the
boards,
boards and the deck. That's everything. Right?
So, and that's Mike's design ethos. That's in Wolfpack. And that's in Tank Duel, and it's, I think, going to be in everything he does. Right. But that drew me into the game. So, to answer your question, because we kind of got off track there, but I reached out to Mike and just kept playing the game with him. And after a little while, he said, "Hey, like, what you're doing is called game development. Are you interested in working on this?" And I just thought, I want to play test. But Mike kind of drew me in more. And so he mentored me through the process, and I actually ended up becoming one of the developers on that game, of making sure that we've checked everything. I wrote the rule book, which was quite a thing for somebody who had never played war games to go directly into writing a rule book. With mixed success. I wouldn't look back on that rule book and say it's bad, but I also wouldn't say it's the greatest rule book to grace mankind. So,
rule book writing is like an art.
Yeah.
It really is.
I'm actually really excited about getting to rewrite that rule book for the West Front pack, the West Front expansion that we're going to do in the future, because we're going to have a combined rule book with everything in it, and I'm planning on reorganizing it. I'm very excited about that. But the process of learning how to do game development there was sort of an iterative thing that just naturally happened through Tank Duel. And so when we got near the end of Tank Duel, Mike had been the Coin Series developer up to that point.
Oh, and I didn't know.
And Gandhi was about to go up for P500, and he introduced me to Bruce Mansfield and his brother Scott, who were designer-developer on that, or designer and lead playtester. Scott doesn't want me to say he's a developer. He doesn't like that. and they got on the phone with me, and we were talking about the game, and I got really into it. And Mike was kind of like, "Here, why don't you take it? Like, why don't you run the show on this?" Because I think he was kind of burned out on the series at that point.
Yeah.
So I stepped in to do Gandhi, and then one thing led to another, and I just ended up picking up more and more projects. And Gene was like, "Hey, you're good at this. You should do it for everybody."
Right.
So now the director job is a mixture of running point on complex projects and actually doing the hands-on development, and then directing a team of developers.
Right. So you are the director of development, but you also still do actual development.
Yeah.
And then you sort of like herd the kittens of the developers that you've assigned to different projects or designers have brought to those different projects.
Yeah, I think there's three main roles that I fill. So one is doing hands-on development. So there's games like Hannibal's Revenge, where I am the actual developer doing development on the game. Then there's project management, where I am working with Kai, who's our production coordinator, and Justin Martinez, who's our art director. And every game at the company is fair game for the three of us. We will go through the list and we will say, what does this game need? And any gaps in development, no matter who was responsible for it, because there are games that I don't really touch. Like, we have developers assigned to those series, like Dick Whitaker is the developer for the great GBA CW series.
Right.
I don't get involved in his stuff. He knows how he's running his business. But when the games come to get ready to print, I'm still accountable for whether or not that job got done.
Right.
And so if we're looking at a game and doing final checks on it and there's gaps or mistakes or issues, I step in there to help fix that. And then there's all varied sorts of things that have to happen from art and from layout and from final component checks and making sure that the components are all there when we send it to the printer, and all those kinds of things that don't have explicit owners that basically come back to me.
Right.
So I'm not responsible for, the art direction, but I am responsible for saying, did all the components that needed to have art get done? Like, because it's my job to know everything about the game.
Right.
So I do that part, and then the third part is actually managing our group of developers, some of whom are like just on one game, and some of whom, like Joe Dewhurst, handle like 20 games.
And in that capacity, some designers bring their own developer with them, perhaps, and then sometimes you might have a new designer and they don't have a developer, and you will assign them one. Is that basically how it works?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways that we do that. Some people come in and they're part of a design team. And so it's a designer and a developer, and that developer is someone that they've worked with at other companies or they've worked with in the past, and they want that developer to work with them for GMT. That's fine, we do that. And in that case, the designer kind of works like for the developer. The developer kind of works for the designer in that model, right? And typically what I get is a game that they've finished, and then I just do like GMT's final development on that.
Right.
The second model is we do have some designers who have dedicated developers for them. And so we've taken a developer and we've said, no matter what comes into GMT from this person, we're going to give it to this team. And they're going to work with that developer and have a designer and have a long running relationship with them. And at this point, that's me for a lot of people.
Right.
So if we were to get a game from like Jason Matthews, it would probably come to me.
Right.
And then we have series developers, which own everything that runs through a particular series. So I'm the Coin series developer. So any game that comes in from the Coin series comes to me. At this point, Joe does most of that work. What I'm doing is overseeing the consistency across the whole set of games.
So Joe Dewhurst we're talking about.
Yeah.
Joe would actually do the development on a new Coin game, and then you would check it. You'd be like the final check after Joe.
Yeah, we kind of share the development for a lot of those games. And part of the complexity there is Joe has his own game in that series, so he's not developing his own game. And there are some games that I've been more involved with, like People Power and Fall of Saigon, and there's been games that Joe's been more involved with, like British Way, and obviously the Pure Land is going to be, and he's developing a Fading Star. And then there's games where we've split it almost 50-50, like China's War. So it's a little bit of, I mean, everything here is always a team effort, but Joe has become more and more leading the Coin series as it goes on. And then there's like Levy and Campaign, which has a development team. Fields of Fire has a development team. Men of Iron has a development team. So there's a lot of these groups that have developers that are dedicated to entire series of games and making them really excellent.
Well, here's this question. I don't know if you're going to want to answer it or not, but there's not a lot of money to be made in this business. We all know that. Most playtesting is all on a volunteer basis. Designers get a residual, whatever their every designer, I'm sure, has their own contract depending on the publisher. Where does a developer fit into that sort of, like, how do they get paid? How do they get, like, do they get a set fee? Do they get a residual or
royalty?
A royalty, or is some of this work also like playtesting work?
So the answer to that is it depends, and it's going to depend it varies wildly by company, and it varies wildly by what the work is itself. So I'll answer the question. I want to caveat it by saying, like, this is an evolving situation as we are kind of learning what does development mean and what's the specific value of development. So for GMT, what we've tried to do is we have kind of two different kinds of developers here. We have the developers who are doing work that is that's consistent across a very large number of games, and so we use a mixture of a bunch of different kinds of compensation for them, but they are definitely paid to do that work.
Yeah.
And then we also have developers who kind of maybe are only working on one game and it's more of a passion project, and so they get a stipend and some free games. And then we have we've started to use a lot more breakdown. We've broken down the development process a little bit more, where we have like specific editing tasks that we are actually giving to editors and paying them to do just that work.
Right.
So, we are trying to move away from any, like, this is just my passion project and I'm not getting paid for it kind of work. We don't, that has not borne the best results.
Right. Yeah, you get what you pay for sometimes.
So, but it's, to your point, it's not lucrative work,
No.
right? And especially because the amount of time that people spend on this could vary so wildly. Like, there's people who get really passionate about it and they spend hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of unbudgeted hours working on a game. So yeah.
I only brought it up because there, it's clear what a designer does. It's clear what a playtester does. But the developer lives in this other world. I was, before we started talking, I was talking about in the theater we have this thing called dramaturgy. Dramaturgs are people who help playwrights write their play. Once the play's written, then it goes off to the director and gets produced or whatever. But there's something similar, it feels like, with a developer that's got to kind of shepherd the creation process through, wherever it has to go, with a certain amount of sensitivity, where the game still is the designer's game. It's not the developer's game. So you can't, I've heard horror stories of when developers have fought with designers and because they had an idea of what they thought the game should be, but there does seem to be require a fair degree of sensitivity to make it work, but also keep it moving forward.
So I'm going to give you a fairly long answer kind of to the implicit question there, because I think that this is the heart and soul of development.
Great.
And I think it's missed by a lot of people. So as a developer, I'm representing a lot of different things, and some of those things are in tension with one another. So I'm representing the publisher, and I'm representing the publisher's interest in a game. So specifically, can we sell this to our customers? Are our customers going to be happy with this game? Is this game fulfilling the promises that we've made to our customers? And sometimes we put games up on P500 and we say a thing, we're going to do a thing, and through the course of the game, it becomes apparent that we can't do that thing. So I'll give you an example of that. When we put Rebel Fury up, it was listed as coming with mounted maps. And that was the reason that we had that there was because we were envisioning it as being in a particular market space that would appreciate mounted maps, and because it went up at a time when price-wise mounted maps were a reasonable thing for that game. Well, shipping went up, which means that those heavier game boards were no longer economically feasible, and the game's actual scope changed. And so we would have had to put in too many mounted maps. And Mark really was passionate with that game about making sure that you could play all 3 of the maps that were included side by side, which means we would have needed 3 mounted map boards.
Right.
That would have been a 5-inch box or something. It just blew out what we could do. So there became this moment where we had to make a decision. What do we compromise on? Do we go ahead and put the mounted maps in but not do what Mark wants? Do we do paper maps but give Mark what he wants? Can we do those in a way that still serves the eventual audience of this game and does it well? And then where's that fit into the price point? What can we actually afford to do? And what can we afford to ship? And the other thing is those big, tall boxes like Pacific War, they tend to split when you ship them because there's so much strain from the inside of the box.
Yeah.
So the compromise we had to land on was putting paper maps on the board. And that's all part of the development process is you're sitting here and you're asking all these questions of like, okay, from a publisher perspective, what do we need to do? And then you have to go to the designer and be like, look, here's our tension, here's our constraint. What do you want to do? And how do we serve you? And so Gene likes to say, we like games, but we love people. We try to do all of that relationship based. We try to do it all relationally. I want to have a great relationship with Mark Herman so that when those problems come up, we can just talk about it and make a decision that's as mutually beneficial as possible. So that highlights some of these conflicting needs.
But that's I think that points out that development has a broader scope than maybe some people think of, because you're not just shepherding the design of the game in terms of like the mechanics, what the CRT is going to look like if there is one, that sort of thing, but you're also actually shepherding what are the physical components going to be like. How many what's the limit? How many counters can we have? How many maps? How many whatever?
But that's all done in coordination with Kai, who actually knows how much these things cost to produce and is going and doing the work, and she has the relationship with our printer and all those things. And it's being done in relationship with Gene, who has to maintain those relationships with the designers and is actually running the company. And it's being done in coordination with Rachel, who has to market the game and convince people that actually, this is a game that fits what you want. And these are the promises that we've actually made. So I might be the person lifting my hand up and saying, hey, we have a thing here we need to talk about, but we don't generally make those kinds of decisions alone. Which is
no, I didn't mean to suggest that. I just meant that it's interesting that sometimes we think of developing a game as simply
the rules and the clarity and
how it works, and it's like it's actually
much
how
bigger.
it all gets into the box.
It is, and that includes things like watching people play the game and thinking about how they're interacting with the components, and then suggesting changes to those components to be able to make it easier for folks to play. It includes thinking about quality of life improvements, game balance, things like that. I think the other thing that is a tension that sometimes comes up is a designer's vision might not actually be expressed in the way that the designer wants to design the game. So they might have a game and say, here's my vision for the game, and you play the game and say, it doesn't do that.
Right,
and
exactly.
So you can go back to them and say, we're going to make this change, but it's better if you can use pathos and go back and say, I think you're missing the mark in what you're trying to explain to people. Here is the ways that we can make it better, and lean on your relationship with them and the trust you've built with them over time to help steer that game towards telling the story the designer actually wants to tell. And as a developer, sometimes that means really invasive surgery on the game, and sometimes it means light touch. And so I've had games that are everything from a designer saying, well, I'm stuck and I don't know how to do this, and we've had to go back and rip the heart out of the game together. And I've been doing deep hands in the game work with them on design, all the way over to getting a nearly finished design, and I'm just suggesting little things here and there.
And obviously it's very different with each designer. I'm sure that there's some designers that are really resistant, and the better tact might be to try and find a way for them to come to the discovery on their own, and then there'd be the other kind of designer where you could just be right up front and say, look, this is it. This is the problem.
100% correct. And I think even more than that, there are times when we just compromise on we compromise on the final product because the designer feels very passionately about something, and so we let it go out, even though I might believe that our players would appreciate something else differently. We let the market speak on that. I've been wrong. I've been right.
Right.
I I like to think I'm more right than wrong, but you only find that out once the game is out in the wild.
When you're doing the thing where it's you're going to need to assign a developer to a project, have you had many times where it's like you think that this is going to be a good pairing, and then it's like, oh my god, it's not, and we have to pull the pin on that and reassign or bail out on that relationship somehow?
Yeah, I mean, I think that more than anything that I've ever done professionally, and my professional career is software engineering, but I've been in marketing. I've been I've run call centers. I've done project management, and in all those different things, this is the most relational work that I've ever done. Like, you are taking somebody's art, something they care deeply about, something they're doing not to make money, but because they're passionate about it, and you're turning it into a product for consumption. And that can be done in a way that is very dehumanizing, right? Or it can be done in a way that is very empowering. And so the difference between those two things is often a razor's edge. And so a developer might think, I'm making this game better, but what the designer actually hears is, you are not valuing my art.
Yeah, you're wrecking my thing.
Right?
Yeah.
Or you could say, I'm being very careful not to wreck their art, and they could say, you don't care enough to be real. And so the relationship between the designer and the developer has to be one of empowerment and care for the designer. And sometimes empowering them is actually protecting them from themselves. And so you have to have a strong enough relationship that you can tell them no.
Right.
But you have to have a strong enough relationship that you can also make suggestions that are heard. And some of that comes back to personalities and how they mesh. Some of that comes back to the kinds of designers we work with. And I'll just be like, I don't mind being blunt about this at all. We don't work with designers who won't take feedback.
Right.
So if you are the type of designer who thinks that you've designed a perfect game, you don't even need to pitch it to us, because we're not going to hear it. We want people who want to come in and they want the next game they do with us to be better than the last game they did, always.
Right.
And if you're not interested in improvement, if you're not interested in bettering your craft, like, this isn't a great place for you. There are other places that I think would be better suited for your stuff.
I'm amazed when I did a demo with Volko Ronki of his Coast Watchers game when it was it hadn't even been announced yet, and so talked to him a fair bit around that whole project, and I'm just like gobsmacked at his incredible desire to make this game better than the last one. Like, he's put out so many fantastic games, and he's still like, I think I could do it better. I just need to find I need to find a way to do X or Y better. And I think, like, the best designers are actually doing that. The best designers don't come in and say, this is aces, right? The best designers are constantly striving for something a little bit better.
I like to flatter myself and think that I've worked with some pretty good designers. So I've done development for Mark Herman. I just did Rebel Fury with him. I've done development with Volko, and I worked with Volko and Mark on Fall of Saigon. I've done development with Jason Matthews on Twilight Struggle Red Sea. So I've worked with people who I think know what they are doing.
Yeah.
And
top tier.
I will tell you that all of them have in common. John Butterfield is another one. Space Corp Ventures, we worked on that. They all wanted to learn what they could do better. And I'm sitting here thinking, how can like 35-year-old me, who has been doing this for 5 or 6 years, tell you what to do better? And in each case, they were like, well, you have experience I don't have. You have a perspective that I don't have. Like, okay, generationally, sure. Yeah. But also, I came from a different kind of gaming. My pathway to gaming was different. I'm playing different games than they play now, right? I play those games with my children, and my children have a perspective that they don't have. And they want to hear it, they want to learn from it, and they just believe that every person's perspective is valuable.
Yeah, exactly.
Even if it's not something they'll ultimately use, they treat feedback as a gift.
Yeah,
and they honor it.
And if it's something like if it's a bit negative, it's like, I didn't like this. They don't get their back up. They're like, oh, I wonder what I could have done to have made that better. That they don't take it as you being wrong for not liking it. They wonder about, how did I miss just making that good for that person.
And I would be completely remiss not to come back to Mike here and just say, like, the person who exemplifies that for me is Mike Berticelli. He will listen to every person, and he might say that we ran playtests where we would have people give feedback for 10 or 15 minutes, and Mike would be listening and talking and asking them questions, and they would get up and leave, and I would be like, well, what did you think of that? And he's like, I think this game just isn't for them, and here's why I think that. And he would make his case, and he would say, but here's the things I did get out of what they said. Here are the things we do need to think about. And it might be a tiny little piece of feedback that was buried in something else they said, but he would ask the question to draw that out and be able to understand it. Because there are people who fundamentally misunderstand your game and give you feedback that's not actionable for you. But if you're listening intently, if you are actively hearing what they're saying, if you're engaging, if you're not thinking about why they're wrong, but you're trying to understand what they're saying, you will naturally you will be able to draw out more interesting feedback by asking really important questions, really clear questions, and driving the conversation to a place where you can get something out of it.
Right, because if you're open to it, just about anything is going to give you something.
And that's an art. That's an art.
Yeah, totally. It's the art of like actually listening. Yeah. It's something. Well, a lot of people are better than others, but a part of it is like not sitting and thinking about what you're going to say next.
It's active listening. Right?
It's listening, right? Mm-hmm. It's like and it brings me back to that idea about development work has to be sensitive. It's just it can't strictly be forceful. There's got to be a lot of empathy and sensitivity to what's going on.
Where I've seen development relationships fail is either developers who think they know more than a designer and just can't get out of their own way,
right?
Or situations where the designer was expecting something and the developer didn't meet those expectations in terms of serving the designer's needs. They had an idea of what their job was and they weren't going to go outside of that.
Right.
And so those two things are often linked together, but that to me is what I have seen be the biggest failure, and that can blow up. But most often the developer just disappears.
Right.
And so then that coming back to like my role and how many hats I wear, then that becomes my game. Right. So I have a lot of games where it's like, yeah, we tried to find a developer. The designer bounced off some developers either because the designer has a difficult personality or they're going through a life stage where they need specific things, or they had specific needs for their game, and the developer that we found or the developer who was willing to work on it couldn't meet those needs. And so this is where it's so important, I think, at some companies who use like more of a distributed model of development, if that developer disappears, it all comes back on the designer and they have to do it all themselves. And the end product is often not great. Or it all goes to the owner and they have to do it themselves. Here we have, my job is to take that to my team. And so I have 10 or 12 folks who do development with me. And they're all along that spectrum of some of them are just taking gigs and they're just working on specific things that I need. Like Liz Davidson has started doing rules editing for us.
Oh, great.
And she edited the rules for Red Dust Rebellion and just did a bang up job on those. I mean, they are really nice in my opinion. And that was something where we didn't have to have one of my team take time on that because we were able to have a gig editor do it. And so we're building that muscle. But then we also have a bunch of different skills in my team. Like I just started a program here at GMT that's been around for about a year where we've identified some design fellows. And so this is like a fellow at a think tank, right?
Yeah,
Somebody who you can bring in to consult on and think about specific things. And each one of them has a different area. Mike Berticelli is one, Bruce Mansfield is one, Jerry White, and then Kai is our development fellow. And we use those folks like Swiss Army knives. We have a specific problem, like, well, they can go solve that problem. And so when Mike was laying out the player aid cards for Wolfpack, he called Bruce and he said, hey, Bruce, I want your help thinking through, Bruce is a teacher, how do we teach people how to play this game? What are the educational supports they need? And Bruce just loves thinking about that stuff. So he got deep into it and was able to really help Mike build a set of player aids that not only are references, but actually teach you how to play the game.
Right.
And so those kinds of things, and that a lot of that built on what Jerry did in Skies Above the Reich and the Enemy Coast Ahead series with his player aids and rule books.
Well, and his rule book for Atlantic Chase is just like It's like my favorite rule book of the last 5 years.
Well, and there's a lot of designers who feel the same way and are using that as the template. So Volko's Coast Launchers, right? Wolfpack uses that format. So I think that the goal of that program is to be circulating ideas and learning from one another, which is tangential to development. It's related to development, but it's tangential. We want all our designers here at GMT to be learning from each other and helping each other get better. And too often I see designers who want to work on their projects but don't want to do anything else for anyone. Like they're like, well, I'm not going to get paid for that, or that's not part of my deal, or whatever. It's not really how we do things here. Like, you know, when I was growing up, I worked at the Olive Garden. I waited tables there. Do you happen to know what the corporate slogan is for the Olive Garden? When you're here, you're family. Okay, we used to make fun of that all the time. But that's kind of how GMTs run. Like, once we take one of your games, you're part of the family. And so that is both like a privilege in that we are very transparent with people and tell them kind of how things are going on and have a lot of trust in our designers. And it also comes with, responsibility is too strong of a word, but opportunity for you to be part of helping make other people succeed.
Right.
And what we really want to see here is people who want to make other people succeed and get a group of those people together, because together they're all going to be better than they are if they're apart.
Right. Well, and you see that at the event here with the designers that come by, the weekend at the warehouse events. They're all like chattering amongst each other and saying, "Oh, like
we're all playing each other's games." They're interested in that. They're like, you know, before I came in here, I walked by Jerry White playing Rebel Yell, right? Like it's like he said, you know, I've only played it solo. I'm getting a chance to play it face to face. This is it. I want to see what Mark's done. So it's exactly that. Well, and they're also, that happens outside the warehouse weekend. So Jerry and I had a Zoom call 2 weeks ago and talked about a bunch of his games. Right. And I'm hearing what he's saying, and I'm thinking, like, who do I need to connect him to help make him successful in some of these other things? And there's other designers and developers who are kind of coming up through the ranks, like Adam Blinkensop did development on Red Dust Rebellion. Now, he has his own game, but because he's been doing development with GMT for 2 years, he knows all the people he needs to make him successful. And so his game, now he's talking to the people like Jerry. I mean, he's always had access to Jerry just by coming here, but now he knows what he doesn't know, and he knows the people he can go to for help. And it's a really growth-oriented process.
So, as on top, well, I have a couple other things I want to ask you about. I think we talked a good bit about what development is actually like, but what projects are you working on in terms of development on? Like what's kind of maybe people wouldn't know about, or what can you tell me that you're working on that people might be excited to talk about or hear about?
So my number one project right now is until very recently was helping finish up Red Dust Rebellion. Right. So Joe was the leader on that, and I was doing more of the project management side of it. But that game is done and is going to the printer in the next week-ish. So really excited about that.
Right, yeah.
I am focused on a couple projects now that that's done. One of them is the Weimar Republic by Gunnar Holmbach. That game is late in the art process, so we've got cards, we've got a map, we're working on player aids and rules.
Is that multiplayer or just 2-player?
It's a 4-player CDG covering the entire Weimar period. Yeah. Really interesting game. And then a couple, basically, I like to kind of do one big project and a couple smaller projects that don't need as much attention. So I'm working on getting In the Shadows finished, which is a 2-player French Resistance sort of CDG from Dan Bullock and Joe Schmidt.
Yeah, great.
I'm also then kind of like looking farther down the line. I'm working on the new version or the next volume in the Rebel Fury, the Civil War Heritage series, which is called Army of the Potomac and just went up for P500.
Now, I saw what I think was a photo of some guys playtesting.
But it looked like it had a really long map.
A super long map.
Yeah, so what we're doing there is you can basically link the entire Overland campaign. And so we have we're going to do the map. We're still working out exactly how the maps are going to be sized, but we think it's going to be a 22 by 34 standard GMT map, and then an add-on map that you can overlay. That'll get you the rest of it. And so you can do it as like one big running battle.
Right.
but Mark's working on campaign rules for that and what he wants that to look like. I've got a couple projects coming up that I can't say too much about that I've been working on. As of late, so I'm also working on Away Team with John Butterfield, so we're getting ready to put that into play testing, so that's a big...
And what's that game about?
So Away Team is, it's a spiritual successor to his Ares magazine game, Voyages of the BSM Pandora.
Right, that's what I
So
thought.
you are controlling a crew of an exploration ship, and there's a story that is unfolding as you're exploring these star systems and planets, and the game, I really can't say too much about it because, like, I'm being cagey on purpose because I don't want to spoil anything.
Yeah, I get
and actually, really interestingly, testing that, super complicated because you don't want to just ruin the game for people. So we've got a couple people who are kind of super testers who are gonna go through the whole thing, and they are just gonna, be super involved, and yep, it'll all be spoiled for them, like me. I'm not gonna be able to play the game without having had it spoiled. But we're working on ways to make sure that other people who come in don't have the entire thing ruined for them by playtesting it.
There's a lot of text in this game.
Yes.
Yeah. I know it's not like it, but in some ways it puts me in mind of
Ambush.
His game from like the 80s, where it's like there's just a ton.
So again, just to come back to like growth mindset and doing things new ways. John, everybody asks me, why doesn't John Butterfield redo Ambush? Have you ever asked him?
Well, I think I heard him answer the question, and it's like the amount of writing it takes.
He doesn't want
like,
to do that.
He doesn't. Yeah, exactly. It's like
and the paragraph checking, right? Mm-hmm. There's a note. I think it's in the I'm not sure where this is, but there's in maybe the designer notes for Shell Shock, the 2-player. That's what it's called, right? Shell Shock. Yeah, the 2-player ambush. I think there's a note where the guy, maybe it was Mark Herman who wrote this, but someone who was either the product manager in charge of all of the ambush products, or it was Mark, said, like, there is a guy whose job it was to check all the paragraphs, who was doing all this development work, and every time somebody would come in with a new ambush product, he would like hide somewhere in the office to avoid that level of pain. And it's just a parent reading that note, they're like, oh, this was a big deal when these games came in. And so John, when he brought Away Team to us, he said, here's what I want to do. I want to hire a database administrator, and I want all of this text to get input into a database that has relational checks and generates all of the stuff that points players around, so that we're not checking every paragraph reference, because that's so tedious. And so software bugs happen, but we've hired a database person to do that work for this game. It happens to be John's sister. And that lets us spend our time on other things.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And it keeps us from all hating the game when we're done with it.
I had heard what John had said about Ambush, because he was proud of it and he loved it, but it was like I couldn't go through that again as a designer.
I have a pretty strong feeling that if we can pull Away Team off and it goes well, that there is a potential for use of what we learned there to do an ambush style game system. Modernized with what we've learned.
I'm sure if you could create that sort of a game again,
a more sustainable way,
a less painful way, you'd be interested, because it's super fun. That's my idea of what a great solo game is like, for sure.
So I'm working on Away Team, and then I have a project coming to P500 in May, it looks like, that is going to be set in the Away Team universe, but is a really weird economic Euro game.
And designed by John as well?
No, it's designed by another very famous game designer who I'm not going to name drop right now.
That's good. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, fantastic. Now, okay, that's your development stuff, but you're trying your hand now. You're getting into some actual design work as well.
Poorly, yes.
Well, I don't know about poorly, but is this your first design, or is this
the first one that I haven't just thrown in the trash? Yeah.
Okay, so we're talking about a child game in the Twilight Struggle series, right?
Yeah. So the game is called Twilight Struggle South Asia Monsoon. And what actually the genesis of that was that I worked with Jason on Twilight Struggle Red Sea.
Right.
And when we got to the end of it, I gather that he told Gene, I don't want to do another one of these without Jason, being me.
Yeah.
So when he came back with South Asia as his next topic choice, he kind of approached me and said, "You want to do this together and just go and do it?" And so I said, "Yeah, absolutely." In exchange, I want to show you the prototype I've been building on the Cuban Missile Crisis as a topic for Twilight Struggle. And so I showed it to Jason, and we agreed we'll do a co-design of South Asia Monsoon, and then we'll do a co-design of Cuban Missile Crisis.
Fantastic.
So those two games are both moving along. South Asia Monsoon's on P500, so it's the focus, but I have a pretty far along prototype of how the Cuban Missile Crisis game is going to work as well. And I'm just, love working with Jason. He's a blast to work with. And
he's a great guy.
He and I were just trading emails this last week, and he said, it's great to have somebody who just tones down his crazy ideas. And I'm thinking how much I love having somebody with these crazy ideas. So at one point we were trading emails, and he said, "What if you just couldn't control countries anymore in South Asia Monsoon? Wouldn't that would help model the way that things actually were there, where countries didn't really take sides the same way they did in Europe?" Because so much of what Twilight Struggle does is really about how Europe worked, and then it's kind of extrapolated to the rest of the world. And so as we're going into these regional conflicts, Red Sea was really about teaching people how to play Twilight Struggle. South Asia Monsoon is really about saying, how much can we deconstruct Twilight Struggle and still have Twilight Struggle?
Right. So the other one is more like Twilight Struggle with training wheels.
Yes.
Whereas this is no, we're gonna try everything.
Yeah, we're gonna mess with your assumptions.
Right.
And so lack of control would have been really crazy, because it would have the entire influence economy of Twilight Struggle and how influence is placed and the way control affects that is really cool, designed for effect to show the solidification of a relationship. And the longer that you're allies with somebody, the harder it is to break that. And the kind of way that works is very evocatively done with very simple mechanisms in Twilight Struggle. It's one of the geniuses of the game. Well, in South Asia, that didn't happen. There was a lot of movement back and forth, but that largely came from the fact that in South Asia, so many countries joined the non-aligned movement and were philosophically opposed to alignment with one of the spheres.
Right.
And so we've added mechanisms where countries become non-aligned, and once they're non-aligned, you can't control them anymore. You can only sway them. And so you bring them to your side. Yeah, they're quote unquote supporting the United States or supporting the Soviet Union, but they're easy to convince otherwise if you were to give them MiGs or
right.
Sail the Seventh Fleet into the Strait of Malacca.
When you're over in that part of the world too, it does the world feel less bipolar because there's China.
China's right there.
Right there, right?
And so I've obviously been doing a lot of research for this game, and I've been reading Lorenz Luthy's Cold Wars, which is a great book that I highly recommend. And it's about all over the world, these Cold Wars. But the thesis of the game, or the thesis of the book, is that the Cold War, the prime movers in the Cold War were not actually the US and USSR. They were reactors to things that were happening, some of which predated the Cold War. And I think that you can find many examples that readily prove this. For example, the partition of India in 1947 has its roots in decisions that were made post-World War I.
Right.
And so before World War II, I think the British Empire was aware that they were not holding on to India. And so there's a sense in which everything that happens after that is the agency belongs with the Indian nation and the Pakistani nations. And Nehru becomes this towering figure in South Asia because he is championing the idea that as a post-colonial nation, as a nation born out of this colonial fragmentation, that India has something to say. And so that that comes out in a bunch of different ways. One of them is the non-aligned movement, which he believes is an ethical imperative, and believes that alignment with one of the two major spheres is just not even on the table for India, and stands on that his entire life. But it also comes out in ways that Twilight Struggle can't model well, because Twilight Struggle implies that the prime movers in the Cold War were the U.S. and USSR. So one of the thesis points that Jason and I wanted to make sure came out in the game was the idea that the U.S. and USSR are really kind of like they're trying to get their arms around things that are very much out of their control. These countries are going to become independent. What they control is kind of like, well, how much do we push them towards that, or how much do we try to restrain them? But like, holding on to Malaya really isn't in the cards. Holding on to Singapore isn't really going to happen. So how do we launch them as successful nations, or whatever it is that we decide we're going to do, just walk away and get our hands clean? And so the US has a say in when that happens, or the USSR has a say in when that happens, but they don't get to choose when it happens in the game.
Right.
And that provides agency to those countries implicitly through the game mechanics, and it presents a different narrative about what actually happened.
You know, talking about that, it's I'm suddenly thinking about another game you guys put out just recently, the British Way.
British Way, yeah.
With I think one of the games in there is Malaya, right? It's like
it is.
It's like it feels like we're having a look at the post-colonial world all over again. Like we're having a moment here where we're reassessing what actually went on and how we're going to have a look at these things.
Yeah, and I think that there are some games like Fall of Saigon touches on some of these things with the way the Paris talks work, where we're talking about agency in some of these different actors. Like the Paris peace talks at the end of the Vietnam War are really interesting because they're four-party talks, but not all four parties are actually at the table, right? The Republic of Vietnam wasn't given a seat.
Right.
And so the US is representing them, but the Viet Cong, who are basically a puppet of the NVA, we know now, have a seat at the table. Right? So there's this interesting dynamic that happens there. And the game tries to represent that and give an insight into like, this was a no-win in some ways for the Republic of Vietnam. And because the US was never really going to be fully aligned with them. And so that bad marriage that's represented in Fire in the Lake gains a new dimension in the way that the Paris Peace Talks work in Fall of Saigon. And Stephen Rangazis, the guy who designed British Way, gave us a lot of assistance in kind of designing the Paris Peace Talks.
Oh, right. Oh, well, so you've got the two Twilight Struggle.
Yeah, so I'm working on those.
And when do you? How far along is the first one? When do you think it's going to?
Yeah.
Is it? It's not P500able yet.
So
right?
South Asian Monsoon is on P500.
Okay.
That game will probably go to we'll probably wrap that up this year. We've made a ton of progress on it in the last 2 months. So I have it here demoing this weekend, and then I'm going to take it to Origins Game Fair in June, and I would like it to be ready for playtesting by that point. Full on playtesting, and then there's solo design that has to happen, which I'm already working on, which is going to be more complex than the solo in Red Sea, but not. It's like halfway in between that and what it would take to do full Twilight Struggle. So I'm actually really interested to see if I break the code, if I crack the code here for full Twilight Struggle solo using the same system, and then. That'll go to art with Terry Leeds doing the art. He's going to do the whole thing. Does a great job. And we're going to let him off the leash a little bit with this one. We're not going to make him make everything look exactly the same as Twilight Struggle. And then that hopefully will go to printer by the end of the year. And then as soon as that goes to the printer, we're going to put Cuban Missile Crisis up. And I know Ananda's working on a Twilight Struggle game as well, which I'm not going to spill his beans.
Okay, great.
But that's in progress. And then Jason has said he wants to do the Middle East next.
Right.
So that I think would be our follow-on to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
And the Cuban Missile Crisis is going to be cool because I love the game 13 Days. I don't know if you played that.
Yeah,
but it's
totally.
a great game.
My son only likes to play short games, so it's like that's when he'll play with me, right? It's like yeah. Let's play that.
For my game, the difference, the reason I feel like there's still space to explore there is 13 Days is really the Cold War through the lens of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is used as a framing device. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the battlegrounds and you look at the cards and you look at the model, it speaks to kind of the entire period pre-Carter in the Cold War, I think.
Right.
And I really want to work on a game that's about Cuba and about the Cuban Missile Crisis and about what was going on with the U.S. and USSR in that moment.
Just that, like,
slice
of
that period of, like,
yeah.
The 13 days. I mean, my game covers more like the month and a half there, right. But it's really about how all the pre-13 days stuff landed in the 13 days. And so the core tension is between the US intelligence apparatus and their ability to figure out what's going on and provide accurate intel, which are two different things.
Yeah, totally.
And the Soviet kind of approach of Maskarovka. Like, we don't tell anybody anything. Everything's a secret. The soldiers didn't know where they were going. They were dressed in parkas and then sent to the tropics. And so the game is, this is another really interesting thing, is South Asia Monsoon is messing with all the core Twilight Struggle things, and one of the things is like there was no Cold War paranoia in South Asia the way that there was in the rest of the world. Like or in Europe really. Like it was there, but nobody was going to push the big red button over Burma.
Right.
It just they weren't. It wasn't important enough to those countries to rattle nuclear sabers over. There were flashpoints, like when the U-2 was shot down. Gary Powers' U-2 had launched from Pakistan, so there's these moments when all of a sudden the full weight of the Cold War becomes apparent. But the general vibe is very much like nuclear war was not going to be started because of what happened here. And so DEF CON isn't even present in South Asia Monsoon. Well, Cuban Missile Crisis is literally the opposite.
Yeah, totally.
And so it has a much longer DEF CON track, and there's a lot more granularity to DEF CON.
Oh, that's interesting.
And one of the things that I'm playing with in the game that I don't know if it's working all the way yet, but is the idea that like when you play a card in the first two turns, which represent roughly week 1 and week 2, you are triggering you're setting the fuse on something that could go off on Black Saturday, which is that last day of the crisis. And so if you look at what happened on Black Saturday, like there was a US U-2 that got lost and accidentally overflew the Soviet Union. There was a U-2 shot down over Cuba. When the U-2 that overflew the Soviet Union was returning, the base in Alaska that it was trying to return to scrambled fighters, but because DEF CON was at 2, those fighters were launched bearing nuclear rockets, and that's the only armament they had. So if they had tried to shoot down the Soviets, it would have been a nuclear incident.
Right.
That's the day that the submarine flotilla commander, Vasily Arkhipov, prevented nuclear war by refusing to turn the key to launch a nuclear torpedo. That's the day that LeMay was finally told, no, we're not going to do an invasion of Cuba. And it turns out years later, the US found out that there were tactical nukes pointed at the beach in Cuba. And if we had invaded, they would have nuked us. So there's all these places where you look back and you're like, man, we were within a hair's breadth. And so I want all of those things to come from cards that have been put out. So like if you play Operation Starlight in turn 1, and you trigger that event, that cues up the U-2 overflying the Soviet Union because that was an Operation Starlight U-2. And I want all of that to turn into DEF CON drops on Black Saturday on the track that can trigger nuclear war. So you feel like that last turn, your hands are just completely tied by the decisions you made before.
And the game can then also end with the nukes flying and we both lose and like everybody loses and
but again, coming back to my thesis, my core thesis is that Kennedy and Khrushchev would not have pushed the button. That if it happens, if the button got pushed, it was the decision of a fighter pilot. It was the decision of a Russian commander looking at US troops coming up the beach. It was the decision of a Cuban commander who was put in a position to have to decide, am I going to turn this key or not?
Right.
And I think in those moments, history has proven that they will make the decision to launch. And if it weren't for accident or maybe divine intervention, I think that nukes would have been launched. Like we look back and we see stories in the Cold War of keys being turned and not working, right? Or of like Vasily Arkhipov, who is a hero, who just said no.
No,
and overrode 2 other people. So I think that those stories are really important and interesting, and I think that we have in some ways lost the, Bruce Mansfield likes to say, like, we've kind of lost the aesthetic there. Like, the things that we do and talk about culturally no longer reflect any awareness of what was going on. And that is both good, because it means we're no longer living in the duck and cover era of life, but it's also sobering. It also can be a sobering aesthetic to live in. And so I think bringing that back out can be very helpful.
It feels like we lost a bit of that aesthetic when, in '89 and post that.
Clinton era,
Once we learned about the Soviet military wasn't as up to snuff as we had feared, and the quality of life there was even worse than we thought, and all the things we found out about, like, they weren't really our match.
Yeah, but none of that was really true in 1960 in the same way.
Yeah.
I mean, Kennedy obviously famously campaigns on a missile gap that doesn't exist, but nonetheless, I think that there was a different thing going on in the early Cold War.
Right.
And so I think bringing some of that out and talking about it can be really helpful. And so I want to do it in a way that is as accurate to the history as I can while still being evocative of the way that it feels. This is one thing about Twilight Struggle is there's a lot of people who would argue that Twilight Struggle isn't actually a very good model of the Cold War, and I would agree with them. But I don't think that matters because Twilight Struggle feels like the Cold War. So again, coming back to that aesthetic, the question is culturally, what can we learn from the fact that we think that feels like the Cold War? And if we compare that to the history of what really happened, what does that tell us about how we feel and why we feel that way? And is any of that important? Yeah, I think it is. Mm-hmm. And so I think that a game on the Cuban Missile Crisis can play with those concepts and in a playful and interesting way can shine light on what is it today that is so much different about the way that we treat armed conflict that could just as easily turn into nuclear armed conflict? But we don't spend a whole lot of time worrying about that the way they did in 1960, 1961. So that's a question I want to play with. Also, the Soviet archives have been opened.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
Sergei Plokov wrote a book called Nuclear Folly. I'm pretty sure that's the author's name. Highly, highly recommend that book. Super interesting. And it talks a lot about Khrushchev's perspective and what he thought was going on and why he was caught off guard by Kennedy and the U.S. response and the ways that his relationship with Castro was so manipulative to the Soviet position. And so in some ways, the Soviets got triangulated. Right? They made a move that they thought was powerful for the Soviets and really that they expected the US to ignore because they didn't feel like it changed anything. And the US, for domestic policy reasons, couldn't ignore it, and Castro felt disappointed when the USSR didn't want to really lean into it. And so they kind of got stuck between Kennedy's demands and Castro's demands in a way that was ultimately ended up costing Khrushchev his position, and led to international loss of face.
Right.
Although not immediately. Right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, international opinion was pretty negatively directed towards the United States as the escalator. It's only in the 10 years after that changes and the USSR is seen as having lost the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah. Well, and then they ultimately lose.
Right.
Well, I'm excited to see the game when it finally sees the light of day. I think that's all. That's all my questions. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about before we wrap things up, or?
No, I mean, thank you so much for the interview and the time and for being here. This is great.
I'm so happy to be here. And I think it's going to be interesting for people to sort of think about development as a separate thing from design and kind of. I think you've shed some light on a few dark corners of how the sausage gets made. Yeah, for people who are more interested, I wrote an article in C3I Magazine that's called What is Game Development? I think it's issue 35. That is a great resource that talks about kind of the difference between design and development and what the different steps of development are, so I would recommend that. And then the other resource that I would recommend for people who want to get into game development is a book that's coming out by Maurice Suckling called Critical Game Design. Yes.
Paper Time Machine, is the name of the game, name of the book. I would recommend that for them because the questions he's asking are the kinds of questions developers ask to refine the thesis of a designer, and so that book has just as much to do with development as it does.
When I first heard about that game or heard about that book, I immediately tried to see how I could order it, but it was. The only info was it was still just in Europe was the only place. It was okay, I gotta wait till the American.
It'll come out this summer.
Yeah,
so.
There'll be an American publisher, and then everything will be.
I got to pre-read it, and it was just excellent.
It's gonna be great. Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Jason.
Thank you.
I can't wait to see your games.
Awesome.
Ciao.
Jason was great to talk to. And then we went and played Rebel Fury, where he kicked my ass. So all part of the GMT weekend of the Warehouse experience. Okay, on to our game dive. France 40 by Mark Simonitch from GMT. This is a second edition. I never played the first edition, so I can't really let you know about how it's different from its original edition, but obviously there were enough changes that it warranted a whole new version rather than just an update kit. This is another game in Simonitch's zoc-bond series. If you haven't played one before, there's an interesting use of zones of controls in these games. When you have two units that are two hexes apart, with either a hex or a hex spine between them, they form a zoc-bond over that hex or hex side. Zones of control work as you've seen in many games where you have to stop when you enter them, but zoc-bond hexes can never be entered, nor can zoc-bond hex sides be crossed. Where in many games you can move at least out of a zone of control into another zone of control, and you can kind of scoot around a zone of control. You can't do that with these. So you can make a decent defensive line with units in every second hex in these zoc-bond games. The units are mainly divisions, but subunits go right down to battalion. Hexes are approximately 4 miles across, and turns represent a single day. Games on the Fall of France always have to wrestle with a thorny question. How did France, with the best army in the world and some of the best armor in the world, fall so quickly and decisively? I've read a fair few books on the subject, and I still couldn't say definitively. There was definitely a disconnect between the War Department on a political level and the actual army. There was almost universal belief that the one place the Germans wouldn't come was through the Ardennes woods, as it was thought to be poor tank country. This, even though they had several intelligence reports telling them otherwise. And it could also be argued that the Germans had much better leadership and initiative, whereas the Allies were always waiting on orders from above. In any event, of course, the Germans attacked mostly in the center of the French line through the Ardennes. They also did a feint attack in the north, where the majority of the French army was located along with the British Expeditionary Force. This is where the French were certain the main attack was to come, and so the Allies pushed forward into Belgium in an effort to hold the Germans along the Dial River. The Germans let the Allies push eastward in the north, while they pushed westward in the center with the bulk of their force. And then they turned northeast once they were behind the bulk of the Allied force, the famous sickle cut, and raced to the sea, cutting off the BEF and the better part of two French armies, eventually leading to their evacuation at Dunkirk. After that, the Germans were able to give the remnants of the French army their full attention, and France was soon to fall. So, how do you design a game that makes sure the Allies plow too far into Belgium and forget about the Ardennes route? How do you make sure the French command is sluggish compared to the Germans? Many designers have used Iron Maiden rules in the past to force the French to do things that are clearly not in their best interest. These sorts of rules can make for an unenjoyable experience for the French player, obviously. Simonitch here sidesteps most of the problem with one choice right up front. Rather than starting the game on May 10th with the initial thrust through the Ardennes, he starts it on May 13th, and the Germans are ready to cut the Allies off. He also cuts the action up into two separate games. The first is called Sickle Cut, and the German will win if they manage to keep the Allies from having any rail routes from the north to the south or southwest, while at the same time occupying as many of the Allied entry hexes as possible. The second game is called Dynamo, and it picks up starting the day after Sickle Cut game ends. It has its own map, which is the area directly north of the Sickle Cut map, and it features Dunkirk on the northwest coast. In this game, the object is simply for the Allies to evacuate 15 units off the west or south map edge. If not, then it's a VP race with the French trying to score points by exiting units, having units still in supply at game end, and destroying German divisions. There's also rules for a combined game if you've got the table space for the two maps. Initially, Sickle Cut game was the more interesting of the two to my mind, and I suppose it still is a little bit, but it's close. I like them both. The game starts with the French strung out along a line running north-south from mid-Belgium in the top to south of Sedan in the south. Their units are heavier in the north along the Dial line, where they're given some fortified markers to beef things up. The Germans attack all along the line. With the help of their air power, they'll break through at some point, likely once they're through the western edge of the Ardennes. And then it's a matter of racing west as fast as possible while still staying in supply and trying to sit on every rail line along the way. At some point, the French have to fall back and try to hack their way through to open a line. So the French will get to attack a bit as well. In my place, it felt like it was going to be fairly easy for the Germans as they broke through easily, but it's not so easy to maintain such a long line. You need to keep everyone in supply and deny the rail lines. And every entry hex you capture basically costs you a unit. So, you start to run out of cheap troops. It's a near run thing. As a further bit of chrome for the sickle cut scenario, Simonitch has added a couple simple but effective tweaks. The German player is given 6 GHQ counters, numbered 1 to 6. Each turn, the German player gets to place any of them that are not in play on any French stacks. Then he rolls 2 dice, and the chits that match those 2 dice are taken back off and placed aside to be placed again next turn. But any French units under the remaining GHQ chits are seriously hampered. Their movement is limited, they can't attack. I think it's a nice balance between letting the German dictate where the French are hampered, the random removal is great, but also not having real effects on the most important units. As the game progresses, these markers are removed altogether one at a time, so that by the final 2 turns there's only 2 left. But it's a cool way of ensuring that there's a little bit of command confusion on the French side. Similarly, there was a point in the real invasion where Hitler feared the armored divisions were getting too far out in front of the rest of the army and ordered a halt. Rather than having this strictly scripted, anytime after turn 5, the French player can place 6 halt markers on German mechanized units that are west of the German infantry. They then roll 2 dice and remove 2 of the markers, just like with the GHQ markers. And these units, still marked, will be unable to move for a turn. But unlike the French is it GHQ or GHG? I'm not sure. Whatever. The halt markers are only in play for a single turn. The halt mechanic gets used again in the Dynamo scenario, but this time for the first 3 turns of the game, allowing the Allies a little extra wiggle room off the top. As well, for the Dynamo scenario, there's a rule for Belgian surrender, which leads to the immediate removal of all Belgian units from the map, which is pretty shocking when it happens. But the big chrome rule for Dynamo is the evacuation rule. Getting your units to Dunkirk is not enough. They don't simply just get to exit. Only 1 to 3 per turn will be able to get out. This obviously represents the lack of enough harbor space and the difficulties of evacuating directly off the beaches. You're going to be fighting off the Germans while you wait to get enough units off. I haven't mentioned movement or combat, but it's all pretty familiar to anyone who has played hex and counter operational games before. Units have movement allowances, and different terrain types cost varying movement points to move through. Combat is odds-based via combat results table. There's column shifts for having armor when the opponent doesn't, for having elite or poor troops, or for having combined arms. Familiar results such as step losses, exchanges, and retreats are spiced up by Simonitch's determined and desperate defense rules. These allow a unit facing a retreat a chance to roll again and maybe hold, but with a risk of losing an extra step, whether successful or not. The other interesting thing about the CRT is that retreats can be up to 4 hexes in length, and advancing after combat can be as long as 4 hexes as well. There's a surprising amount of movement involved in the combat resolution, as retreats are more usual than step losses. The whole thing comes together in a very satisfying package. The rules are straightforward with very little errata that I've seen so far. GMT rates it a 5 out of 10 for complexity, and that's exactly where I'd put it. There are other games in the zoc-bond series that feel more complex to me, but I think that's just due to their size. But with France 40, if you're not combining the 2 games, this is a classic 1-mapper, your typical 2-foot by 3-foot arrangement. Sickle Cut is 10 or 11 turns, and Dynamo is 12, so neither is overly long. And the Dynamo feels like it has less units, so it's really not longer than the Sickle Cut scenario. You can play this in a day with time to spare, I think. For similar games, I've also got the classic Jim Dunnigan designed France 1940. I have the Avalon Hill edition with the fantastic cover. This game has a lot going for it. Each size has a selection of battle plans or orders of battle to choose from that allow you to set up hypothetical scenarios. And depending on the mix of plans, the victory requirements change. That's somewhat satisfying, but it's based on Dunnigan's view of the time that the Germans had a bigger and better army. I'm not sure I agree with that. So if you play with historical plans and orders of battle, the Germans should never lose. Not altogether satisfying to my mind. As well, there's a little help for the Germans baked into the design. German infantry corps are rated as 7 strength, while the French are rated as 6. That means if the German attacks the French at 7 to 6, it plays out on the 1 to 1 column, but when the German rolls a counterattack result, the French will be forced to counterattack at a 1 to 2. This is a significant disadvantage. So France 1940 isn't my first choice for this campaign, but I still play it from time to time just for nostalgia and because it's quick and very smooth. I just don't agree with some of the assumptions underpinning the design. As much as the alternate setups and OOBs are cool, I don't find them a satisfying way to deal with the problem of how did France lose? Which makes sense, as it appears Dunnigan didn't think France had any chance of winning. No Retreat, France and Poland by Carl Paradis is my other main game on this topic. Carl's No Retreat games feature limited counters and cards. Though they are not exactly CDGs as you might think of them, the cards give you bonuses or abilities, or deny your opponent the same. They don't drive the play. No Retreat France has its own mechanisms to keep the game balanced. Each side has 5 secret plan cards to determine that side's objectives for the game. The German draws one and plays it face up so the French player can see it and then draws another face down. Then the German player secretly keeps one of them and discards the other. So the French player knows one plan but doesn't know if the German player will use it or another unknown plan. I think this replicates the French finding out the Germans' initial plans for the invasion. Then the French player then draws his secret plan. There's a chance they may get a chance to change it, but it's not likely. And then there's the regular cards. To begin the game, the German gets to draw 10 and keep 4, so that's a fair bit of agency in shaping the opening. The Allied player draws 2 and is stuck with them, so less agency and less cards for the French. The game also gives the Germans a greater movement allowance for their armored units and an advantage in air support. And then finally, each side starts with a leader in command, which may change partway through the game. France starts with Gamelin, who has some restrictions on how units work together. He's eventually replaced by Weygand, who is a real upgrade but costs VP. The Germans start with Brauchitsch, who is pretty good, but if or when Hitler takes over direct command, the Germans are more restricted but gain VP. There is an Iron Maiden rule for the first 3 turns that prohibits Allied units from entering the Ardennes, but I don't recall a rule that makes the units on the dial line stay that far west for a few turns. I don't know, perhaps it's baked into the cards. So, this game does have to resort to a bit of an Iron Maiden rule for the German push through the Ardennes, but other than that, there's a lot to recommend it. The secret plans really spice things up as they change some of the victory points awarded at the end of the game. You won't really know if you won or not until the plans are revealed. As to which game I'd rather play, France 40 or No Retreat, it really feels a bit like apples and oranges. France 40 is very old school hex and counters in many ways, many good ways, whereas No Retreat is area movement and features cards very prominently. It's a toss-up. I couldn't really pick. I'm happy to play them both. Parting shots. Well, hats off to Gary and all the folks that make the Charlie Awards happen. While we all may grumble about what did or didn't win or what did or didn't get nominated, let's not forget it's a huge lift to keep this thing going, and it's all volunteer. I've created and run an annual awards project on another topic in my hometown, and I'll tell you, everyone can be happy with 95% of what you do, but they only want to talk about the 5% that they disagree with. So here's to the Charles S. Roberts crew. Thanks for the full 100%. And thanks again to those who have become ongoing supporters of Pushing Cardboard, either through YouTube or Ko-Fi. And thanks as well to those who took the time to use my affiliate link while shopping at Noble Knight Games. I really appreciate it. That's it for another episode of Pushing Cardboard. You'll hear from me again in a month or maybe sooner. In the meantime, I'll talk to you on the website or the Discord server. Happy gaming.